Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Sauer. I'm Scholar Services and E-Resources Librarian here at Forsyth Library. I'm a member of the Scholarship Environment Committee, which has a subcommittee called SACOG, which I'm also a member of, along with Dr. Ali. So Forsyth Library reached out to them, and we are partnering with them to present, once again, our tips and tricks for presenting at professional conferences. We've expanded the workshop series this year to add a few more sessions, and also a work session as well. Today kicks off that whole series with, from Dr. Hendrala Ali, Geosciences, getting started on a project, research, scholarship, or creative activities. So I'm going to give that over to her.
Thank you.
There's going to be all kinds of time. I know that. I hope you'll enjoy it. Thanks.
So, what I want us to do is, I think, I'm assuming that people are from different programs, not everybody is from the same department or the same program. So what I want us to do is try to get started if we don't already have a project. How many people already have a project that they are working on? Okay. How many people are thinking of having a project? Okay. So for those people who have project, you can just use what you already have and then continue from there. For those who don't have a project, you're going to try to start an idea, something to get you started, so that you can figure out how to get along with it. So what I'm going to do is present how you start with an idea, your goals, your objectives, the methods that you might want to use, how you work with the results, the discussion, and then how you conclude. We will not spend too much time on the last part because you can't get to the last part until you do the first part. So we're just going to go as much as we can and end wherever time stops us. So to start a project, you have to go through some steps. Most of the time, you have to brainstorm an idea to identify a problem or a situation or a question or a hypothesis, something that you think needs investigating. So for most people, that would come from your area of specialty, so your department, your area of interest. Those are the different areas where you're going to identify the problem or the question that you want to address. So once you've identified this problem, you're going to determine what you want to learn about that problem. This is very important, actually. If we take an example of water, you can learn different things about water. If you're a chemist, you can look at the composition of the water that you're dealing with. If you're in policy, you can look at water use, water distribution. If you're in law, the legal profession, you can look at the problems that arise because of water and how people use water, so pollution, things. So in every discipline, you can find something to study about water. You just have to look at it from that perspective. So in your research, that is the key thing that you're going to want to do, is to figure out, I don't know how to use this.
That's a mouse, actually. I think.
Just
Just a
use the
mouse?
space bar on the, no, it's not.
You're going to have
Sure,
to
the
figure
pointer.
out what you want to learn about your topic. Okay? And then, once you figure out what you want to learn, that is automatically going to lead you to the type of idea. Thank you. It's going to give you an idea of the kind of data that you need. Whether it's going to be numerical data, it's going to be reports, interviews. Once you figure out kind of thing that you want to learn from your project, it's going to give you an idea about the data. Once you know the kind of data that you need, or an idea of the kind of data that you need, then you're going to determine the type of actions that you take to get that data. And from there, you would identify the tools and the process that you're going to use to get data. Once you've collected your data, then you can begin to analyze, manipulate your data to see if it gives you the results or the hypothesis that you started off wanting to figure out. So this basically summarizes some of the steps that you go through in working with in trying to start a project. So the first thing is, have to brainstorm an idea to identify a problem or a hypothesis. The question is, where do these ideas come from, right? Several sources, like I said, for students, one of your biggest source of ideas is going to be your advisor, your mentor, person that you work with. Usually they have ideas and they would suggest that you might want to do this, you might want to do that, and then you have to take that and make it your own. So for most of you, I figure that might be where you are going to get your ideas. Or sometimes they're going to tell you, here's a set of resources, go figure out what it is that you want to do with it. So you can go and look at what other people have done and see the problems that they did not address, and then use that to do case studies. Or you might be reading something and discover that there are gaps in the literature or in the studies that people have made over time, and they've not been able to answer certain questions that you want to pursue. Or you can, from your own experiences, the things that you're interested in, you just want to find out more. It happens a lot. Just go online and you start researching stuff. So your experiences, your interests, your musings, you just sit and you think about things and you say, why hasn't this happened? You go after it. So you can, if you are an academic, most of higher order researchers, they might know some theories, some hypotheses that already exist. They might want to test them, or they might want to verify some concepts that people already did, clarify things that exist that are not very clear, that's still a little bit murky. You may want to invent something. There's a need and you're really driven to innovation. You want to invent or create something that is going to address a need. You don't just start and invent, you go through a process of research and building. And then sometimes you want to create. So if you're in the arts or humanities, you want to create poetry, stories. I mean, those are things that will be very unique to your interest, and you're going to go through research, reading what other people have written, looking at the artwork that other people have produced to be able to start something new. So these are all the areas where you can get your ideas from. For each of you though, I think you have your own preferential resource for ideas. So depending on who is giving you the idea or the resources that you want to use, here is a list of some of the tools that you can use to come up with an idea or a problem. So maybe you're interested in just describing something. You want to, if you learn something and understand it very well, then you can describe it. So you cannot describe something unless you understand how it works. You might want to explain how something functions. You may want to apply something that you know. Test your ability to use information that you already master. You can analyze, so you reorganize, you structure, you arrange information that you've gathered or that somebody else gathered. Or synthesize, which means you're taking different parts and you're combining them together. So this is really like the Bloom's order. You're going from the very simple to the more complex. So people who have done advanced research, they would mostly want to evaluate things. Those who are just starting, they might be doing description, application, explanations, and things like that. So you have to figure out where you fit in the research that you want to do. Everybody might be able to evaluate some things, But if you're starting something new, you're probably going to start from there, from the top part, describe and explain before you can evaluate and apply. So the first thing I want us to do now is take a break from me talking and you doing something. So everybody must have had these note cards, right? I want you to take a few minutes and write down your main idea using the key words that we obtained from this taxonomy. So basically, you just want to figure out if you're wanting to describe something, if you want to design, if you want to create. It's going to vary depending on your background. And if you need to discuss this with somebody or talk with somebody, don't hesitate. Just take maybe 5-7 minutes to do this. If you already have an idea, write it in a very clear manner, what it is that you're going to do, and then come around and pick at what you're doing and make sure that you've actually written something down. You can also use more than one, so you can write several different ideas. Usually that's what happens. We start off with several ideas and then we narrow them into one big concept. All right? So, if you need help, I can dialogue with you. So the next step is we want to figure out the goal of what it is that you want to do. You've identified an idea. Now, where are you taking this idea to? What is the goal? What is the big picture? So the first thing is your idea trying to describe something? So you've written things down. Is it describing how something works, what is happening, what are? So these words you're going to use to figure out, to specify your hypothesis, because most of the topics that you've identified are very broad, right? And at the end of the day, you want to do something that is sufficient for the time that you have and the resources that you have. So if you're describing, mostly you're going to have questions about how, why, how many, how often things happen. If you're trying to connect, relate, or correlate things, then you're looking at relationships. So I've talked to some people who are trying to look at relationship between things, or compare and establish similarities and differences. So some people were looking at comparison. So now this is where you have to figure out exactly where you fall in each of these different groups. The last part is causality. Are you looking at the effect of something or the cause of something? So again, depending on your discipline, you might be trying to find the cause of a problem or the effect of doing something. So if somebody was looking at the effect of using octopus for something, right? So that is looking at an effect. You might also look at the cause of a problem. The important thing about looking at goals is that you want to make sure that what you're trying to work on is not something that has a very definitive answer. So if you ask a question, can you run? If the answer is yes, there's nothing to research, right? It's definitive. So it has to be something that is a little bit more nuanced, something that lends itself to investigation. It should also be something that you can test, that you can apply certain tools to verify. And of course, if it is research, it should be something that has not yet been proven. Because we normally teach things that are proven in class, but for things that you research, we don't yet have an answer. That's why we're trying to look for we're investigating it as a research problem. So, the second part of what I want us to do now is to try to take the idea that we had at the beginning and put it into a statement, a goal, or a research question. So what's the purpose of what it is that you want to do? For the most part, it starts very easily, very simply. So the study that you're trying to do aims to describe something. Okay? or the study is designed to replicate something else that somebody has done. It could also be that you want to address a problem, a perception, a question, you want to answer a question. You want to do an inventory of something. So somebody talked about library, maybe you want to do an inventory of how certain things function in the library, right? Or develop a model. You want to develop a conceptual, physical, clinical model of something. So you want to try to use any of these statements to write out your purpose based on what you wrote earlier. So now put it in a more succinct form. And there's still more cards. So the first one was just an idea. You just wrote it anyway it came to your mind. Now you want to write a purpose or a goal to that idea. All right, so did everybody get a little bit comfortable with the purpose of what it is that they want to do? Okay. So now that we have a purpose, we're going to write our objectives. And basically what we're going to do is, how are you going to achieve or meet your goal? So generally, it's good to have more than one objective. 2 to 3 is good. Steps that you're going to take to achieve the goal that you set. So you want to investigate something. How are you going to get to that point? So what I want us to do is, third activity is write at least 2 objectives using clear action verbs of things that you would do to meet the goal that you just set for yourself. Whether you're trying to identify something or, so you can use, again, you can see that this goes from the simple to the highest. And I will show you an example in a little bit. So I can decide to describe something. I'm describing it so that I can understand it well enough in order to compare with something else. So I have to describe 2 different things, and then I'll compare them. Then once I've compared them, I would establish differences. So I'll distinguish between those 2 things, right? If I distinguish between those 2 things, then I can use that information to construct something that is going to allow me to interpret an environment. So in this case, I would have maybe about 5 objectives. The first one would be to describe, and then the second one is I'll compare the results of my description, and so forth and so forth. So depending on how big you want to do your study, or how small, you might have just one objective, which is just describe. If you're just starting, just describing is enough. But you might do a little bit further, describe and then classify, or describe and then compare. So use any of the words that you have on there to see if you can write a couple of objectives for your purpose. So usually you just want to start the objective of this project is or are, then 1, to do this, 2, do that, 3, do that, and then you get a list of things that you need to do. Because those will determine how you follow up in the actions that you are going to take. Right? So a little bit more work. Let's write those objectives now. Let's move a little bit further now into the introduction. So the introduction is where you're going to give people a little bit of information about the background of what you already know about what you're doing. Most of the time, somebody would have done something else in this area. So you're going to think about the background. Basically, based on your subject area, your introduction is going to vary. But you're going to think of the area where you're doing your work, or the book you're working on, or the environment you're working on. You're going to talk about that. You're going to give a brief summary of the topic, what other people have done, and then state your overall. This is where you state your goals and your objectives in this section of your work. So what you might want to do is to write a couple of sentences. I don't know that most of you already have a lot of information about what it is that your introduction is going to be about, but you have ideas of where you're going to find that information. So you might want to just note that down. Are you going to talk to somebody? Are you going to interview people? Are you going to, is it a resource in the library? Are there papers that you have? So you want to kind of note down where you're going to get these resources so that you can then follow up with your introduction. I think we're running a little bit from time. So this is the last big part that I want us to talk about. We've written our objectives. From those objectives, we can now determine how we are going to conduct this research. So what are the methods that we're going to use? And basically, you're going to determine the processes or the tools. So how are you going to conduct this work, or what are the tools that you're going to use? So if you're doing literary work, you're probably going to be reading a lot of papers or articles, compiling that kind of information. If you're doing field work, then you might go and measure something. So whether you're doing, if you're doing quantitative data or quantitative research, which means that you're going to get numerical data, numbers that you can count and manipulate. You're going to have to collect those numbers, compile them in some way. If you're doing qualitative research, which is non-numeric, then you're going to be describing things a lot. You're going to interview people. You're going to observe. You're going to read books and document things. So depending on what area you're looking at, you can now see where your method is going to fall. And again, it doesn't mean that if you are in one program or another, you might not be able to do one or the other. In each program, you can do quantitative or qualitative. It doesn't really matter. Some people tend to think in history you only do qualitative, or in sciences you only do quantitative. No, it depends on your objectives. It is the objectives that determine whether it is quantitative or qualitative. So, since you already have your objectives, can you now identify the tools or the processes that you would use to gather your data? So maybe a couple of minutes to just write down the tools that you would use. Just based on this list, for example. This is not exhaustive, but it's the more common ways that we gather this information. Everybody happy with their methods? So this first part to me is the most important step in studying research. If you can figure out what it is that you want to do or what you want to know, what are the actions that you're going to take to accomplish that, and what are the tools that you're going to use, then doing your research becomes less frustrating. Once you've applied your methods, though, the next thing is that you're going to obtain data. You're going to have data in several different ways. So this comes in way later on in your research. You're going to compile results. If you're qualitative, you might have quotes, you might have stories, it might be a verse, it might be something that you write. If you're in quantitative, usually you have a lot of numbers. People are not patient looking at numbers, so you have to convert it into tables, into graphs, into charts. Sometimes, whether you're doing qualitative, quantitative, images say a lot, so people take pictures, they do diagrams. Those are different ways of presenting what you've collected as data, so that people can easily understand what it is that you have to do. And then you can report it in several different ways. Once you've collected your data and organized your results, then you have to tell people what it means, because you know it better than anybody else. So that is where the discussion interpretation part comes in. Tell people what it means. You explain any trends that you see. Are things increasing together? Are they decreasing together? Do they correlate or not? Depending on what your objectives were. You're going to explain all these trends. And then relate this to what other people have done. If somebody did something similar, does it match what they did, or does it disagree with what they did? And if there were things that you could not do or did not do, you want to state those limitations here so that somebody else can use that to start their own project. And sometimes if you're building things, you might create models so that people can see the progression of what it is that you did. At the end, what I want you to remember is that you are the researcher. So most of the time you know this stuff more than anybody else, including your advisor, because you're the person who's been working on it every day. So as long as you collect your preliminary data, or you do your preliminary research, which means reading, trying to understand what other people did, how they did it, and you have your data, the rest can fall into place pretty easily. But you just have to be sure that you're investigating something that is going to be useful for some reason. It's a problem, it's an issue that people want to understand or would be interested in. Then, of course, after that, you're going to have to present your work, because if you do all of this and you don't share it with anybody, then nobody knows that you did it. All this effort would have been for nothing. So organizing your presentation is pretty straightforward, or it looks straightforward, but again, you have to make it flow according to how you want to tell the story, because it's really like telling a story. So with that, I want you now to go back and see if you can figure out, just from what we have and from the methods that you're going to use, what form your data is going to be. Are you going to have words, caselets? Are you going to have figures, charts, table, graphs? So graphs tend to compare two things. Like line charts, you're looking at X and Y. And charts can be a little bit more, a graph is a chart, but a chart is not necessarily a graph, basically, that's what it is. And then are you going to use maps, images, are you going to do models to represent the things that you're thinking about? So take a few minutes and write down a few of these just to see what your results would look like. Because again, that helps you in organizing how to do your work. I'll answer any questions if you have questions, or if you just need help thinking something through. And don't forget that our next speaker is going to be talking specifically about how to prepare for SciCAD, which is our big campus event coming up in April 25th.